Hi, this is Harold Pollack, and I'm recording for you the first lecture in my Economics for Social Welfare class, Crown 454. I should say that a lot of these slides I've made, but some of them I've taken from Krugman and Wells material, so please don't post outside of the class, without asking, just so we can respect their copyright. What I want to cover today is sort of first principles, kind of the what's covered in chapters 1 and 2 of the book with my own elaboration. So I'll just jump right into it. First of all, thank you for taking my class and for helping to pay my salary, and I will try to earn that. Let me lay out some expectations for the class that expectations on me and expectations on you and your peers. I will come prepared for class. You will come prepared for class. It means doing the readings, putting the time in. There's economics is something that you got to really make an investment in so that you can understand the concepts, and most of your learning is occurring outside of the classroom, and please do that. Respect the views and the perspectives of other people. Of course, do the work with integrity and professionalism. That's true for assignments. It's true for class exams. And be self-aware. We cover so many policy issues, human issues, social issues that impinge on economics in one way or another. And we're all part of human groups. And, every human group in every ideological camp has some insights that others don't have, and also makes distinctive errors and biases that others aren't making that you can learn from. And we're in such an angry, polarized time, we can sometimes forget that. So be self-aware. If there's an ideological camp that's making an economic argument that just seems ridiculous, that's always a good time to stop and think, well, wait a minute, is it ridiculous, or am I missing something? Sometimes things are ridiculous. There are bad arguments out there, but sometimes it's not so ridiculous. It's just either you're missing something, or they just disagree with you on a values premise that's leading them logically to a place you don't want to go. But it's not because they're being stupid. It's because they disagree with you on some value issue. And it's really, it's a normative issue. It's not a logical issue. Class requirements. Class participation counts 5%. It's sort of a fudge factor. But come prepared to contribute to class. Makes class a lot more enjoyable for everybody. 25% weekly assignments, which will be done in small groups. We have an in-class midterm and final. Please come and see me if you have any needed accommodations on these exams. And we work through the Dean of Students office, and not a problem at all if you require accommodations. But just come talk to me so we can figure out how to do that the best. Now, everyone is allowed a single 8.5 by 11 crib sheet that you can bring to the midterm and to the final. And you hand those in at the end of the exam, and we actually give prizes for the best crib sheets. They're making that crib sheet is often a very valuable part of your studying. Also, bring a calculator to the midterm and the final. Please don't use your phone. For obvious reasons, it's not so great to have people using their phones on exams. Let me tell you a little bit about the unwritten curriculum in this class. One thing is, for many of us, it's kind of restamping our math visa. The quantitative reasoning is absolutely essential for policy analysis, and we all have a responsibility to do the basics of that well. And there's lots in the zeitgeist that sometimes leads us to shy away from that. Now, part of that is that we live in an incredibly lazy, popular culture that spreads a lot of toxic messages about math and many other things. One thing is the belief that somehow quantitative methods are part of some neoliberal conspiracy. If you do randomized trials, with rigorous statistical analysis, or you're talking about supply and demand curves, then you're somehow ideologically in a particular camp. And no, that is not true. On the flip side, there's often a view that qualitative methods are somehow less intellectually worthy or challenging, or show less economic insight. That's not true either. as I'll mention, some of the best people at economic reasoning are actually ethnographers and sociologists who have a very tactile sense of what's going on, and understand people's economic reasoning and incentives and constraints in a way that the straight up professional economist who doesn't have that tactile exposure wouldn't know. There's also this idea that you need the math gene to be an effective quantitative thinker. I think this is one of the most toxic things out there. It's a convenient myth that serves both teachers and students well. If there's a quantitative concept that you're struggling with, you may have to put in some extra elbow grease. There's no question that math can be hard sometimes, or it can be counterintuitive, particularly if you haven't practiced it a lot. That doesn't mean you can't learn it, but it may mean that you have to put in a little extra effort. And if you give yourself an excuse and say, oh, I just don't have the math gene, you're not serving yourself well. Now, I must say the same myth also, of course, serves the teacher well. So if you're not getting something, I can say, oh, it's not that I taught it beautifully. There's nothing wrong with my teaching. It's just you didn't have the math gene. So that's why you didn't understand it. And if lots of my students are struggling with a particular concept, very often I explained it in a confusing way. And that's why people are confused, because I did a bad job teaching it. So we have to move away from those kinds of myths. Now, I would make one clarification. Many of us do have particular learning needs that merit accommodation. There's no problem at all. And I'm just honored to work with you to figure out, what's the best strategy to work around that, in whatever way, is most effective, for you. As I mentioned, every ideological camp in American politics and public policy has great insights and makes great errors. You're going to wrestle with this in your first assignment. And economics provides a great terrain to see great examples of that, not least among economists themselves. But you'll see that conservatives, libertarians, progressives, social democrats every one of those groups has some really valuable points and makes some really bad errors in policymaking. And economists, make some really wonderful insights into policy and also get some things really wrong. So we just have to be always self-aware of that. And if you're not learning from everybody, that's often a time to say, hey, wait a minute, what am I missing? Now, why study economics in the first place? One thing, it's a key language of public policy and organizational life. Okay, I'm just going to stop for 1 second, and there we go. So, it's central to your own future as a worker, as a family member, as a consumer, and I should say as a manager. In so many ways, it's all around us. And, just a quick look at the paper gives us some examples. Behavioral economics is a really interesting field that has developed quite a bit over the past 15, 20 years. And I'll see, hopefully I can get some Zoom interviews with some good behavioral economists who can talk about it. It's really the intersection of economics and psychology to try to understand how we make decisions about complicated economic matters, particularly ones that are sort of psychologically fraught. Just examples that we see is, the head trips that we all have about credit card debt, the way we struggle with adjustable rate mortgages and trying to think about those kinds of issues. I'm really upset about the gamified and often toxic investment apps like Robinhood and gaming apps like FanDuel. If you watch an NBA game, there's just constant ads that are trying to push people to make a bet on the game. And many of those, for those of you that study substance use disorders, you'll say, hey, wait a minute, they're specifically pushing addiction like cues. Get your money fast. They show this guy pushing buttons on his phone, and all of a sudden, the money comes in, and wow, that's people using the insights of behavioral economics in a really socially irresponsible way. If we go to health reform, should we require everybody to have health insurance? That's the individual mandate. Health insurance is really designed so that healthy people and lucky people cross-subsidize less healthy people and less lucky people. We're all 25 years old. We're all buying insurance. 1 in 1,000 of us is going to have a bad accident that's going to cause a big hospital bill. We can all protect ourselves against that risk by contributing to a common pool. One of the challenges is that the people who feel that they're really low risk, let's say that I'm 25, I'm really healthy, I exercise all the time, I don't do anything that creates physical risk. I say, you know, I don't think I want to get health insurance and cross-subsidize these other people that are less healthy. Then, or you know what I'll do? I'll wait. If I get some sort of a scary diagnosis, I'll go buy health insurance when that happens. And until then, I'll just free ride on that. You know, that doesn't work. And so the individual mandate basically says everybody's got to be in the pool all the time so that we can all have each other's backs. A very contentious issue. Barack Obama actually really punished Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries in 2008 favored an individual mandate. Candidate Barack Obama opposed it. It was in the Affordable Care Act. But many of us, including myself, who were Obama advisors, we backed him up in the first place, and then we flipped in a way that was quite embarrassing in the sequence where that went. We basically, many of us said, you know, Hillary Clinton's policy was correct, but it was politically a bad idea to push for the mandate at that point. But I think the Clinton people accurately said, hey, you know, that wasn't so great. There's also another aspect of health reform is the government's pricing power in the market, what's sometimes called monopsony power. You know, if you have one payer, one buyer, wow, that person has a lot of market power. And one of the striking things in the Affordable Care Act debate is that many of the allies for universal coverage on the supply side of the medical economy, nonprofit hospitals, for example, they loved everything about the Affordable Care Act except for things that increased the government's bargaining power. There was something called the public option, which was, you know, if you went on the marketplace, you could get Aetna, Cigna, or Medicare. And that's the idea of the public option. A lot of our allies on the supply side said, I don't like that public option thing. My cousin was actually the vice president for nursing at a wonderful nonprofit hospital in rural Pennsylvania, and she did not like the public option. And she said, you know, if I have to bargain with the government over how much I can charge for my 57-year-old heart failure patient in the same way that I have to do for my 67-year-old heart failure patient who's on Medicare, I'm really worried about whether we can keep our doors open. And you know, and that hospital and many others quietly told, you know, their representative, don't push that public option thing. We don't like that. Also, there was interesting incentives facing state governments. Republican governors around the country, when President Trump went to repeal the Affordable Care Act, many of them said, don't get rid of the Medicaid components of the Affordable Care Act. That's huge amounts of money going to my state government that we need to deal with the opioid crisis, things like that. Tuition costs and college competition. There is a really strong arms race in colleges for kids that will basically make the college look good in things like US News and World Report annual rankings, things like that. And so, you know, colleges have an incentive to really give a lot of merit-based aid to kids that, you know, incoming freshmen that, you know, that will make the college look good, even if they don't need the money so much. And, you know, we can all say there's a place for merit scholarships, but many of those merit scholarships are designed to help the college, not the student. And what are we really doing with financial aid? In some ways, what financial aid is doing is it's basically saying, let's try to figure out the maximum that a family is willing to pay or able to pay to come to our college. And that's what we'll charge. We'll have a really high sticker price so that the rich parents are paying a lot. But we'll give a lot of financial aid for the people that are just not going to pay that much. And it's not like we're so altruistic. Maybe that's a component of it, but it's more that, you know, we just know that they're just not going to come to our school if we try to charge them $70,000 a year, you know, to come to Oberlin. We're going to offer them, you know, we'll charge them 35. And another challenge that we have is the very top universities, of course, University of Chicago being one. One of the things that we sell is prestige and the fact that there's a fixed supply of slots in the most selective universities, like almost by definition. And of course, as the number of very qualified students increases, and the number of families who can pay those really high tuitions really increases, what do you think is happening to tuitions at the most prestigious universities? They're going up. It turns out, by the way, the median amount that everybody pays has been surprisingly stable, partly because the most prestigious universities also have gotten a lot richer over time. But there's a real challenge there that comes from just the reality that universities are economic actors like other institutions. Grade inflation is sort of an interesting dynamic, which we can talk about. Also, the incentive issues around loan forgiveness. And, one of the arguments against very generous loan forgiveness is that it will encourage students to take out more loans on the expectation that someday those loans will be forgiven. And there's, that's a serious issue that has to be thought about empirically. Game theory, that's how people strategically interact, how organizations strategically interact with each other, particularly when you have relatively small numbers of players who kind of get to know each other, who are often rubbing up against each other repeatedly. We'll talk about game theory. It's a fascinating subject. I would say there's two kinds of games that really are important to distinguish. One is what's called a zero-sum game. That's one where your win is, by definition, my loss. Two chess players, the Super Bowl, to some extent, although not completely, Russia versus Ukraine. Presumably they both have a common interest in, not escalating to nuclear weapons or so on. But, if Russia takes territory, its gain is Ukraine's loss. Most games in the world are not zero-sum. They're non-zero-sum games. So, you have two gas stations that are across the street from each other, and they're both trying to make money. They compete with each other, but they've got their prices listed. So Harold's gas station, it says $4.50 a gallon. And Veronica across the street owns a gas station. And, she's going to put up a price. She could put up $4.40 a gallon and try to get my customers to come to her because she's a dime cheaper. But if she does that, I might reduce my price to $4.40, and now we're both charging less money for gas, and we're basically competing against each other and driving the price down to where neither one of us is making money. So she might put up a sign instead that says $4.50. We'll just coordinate. We'll offer the same price, and that very transparent, visible price gives us a way to coordinate, so that we are each maintaining a pretty high price for gas. And I want people to come to my gas station, but I don't want to get into some sort of a bidding war with you that hurts us both. Okay. Prisoner's Dilemma is the classic game. You've probably seen that before. So Harold and Veronica are both arrested in connection with a crime, and the police put us in separate rooms, and the let's say we're two 18-year-old kids, and detective comes into Harold's interrogation room and says, Harold, Veronica's basically going to tell us exactly what happened, and I don't have a lot of time in this. I want to resolve this crime pretty quickly, and you can cooperate with me, and you can confess to the crime and tell me what happened, in which case, we'll give you a more favorable deal. Or you can just sit there silently. You have a right to call for a lawyer and not say anything. You do you. But I should tell you that Veronica's going to tell us what we need to know. And if you lawyer up and don't say anything, and she tells us exactly what happens, she's going to get a break, and you are definitely not. Because you're wasting my time. I got a lot of crimes going on here, and I really don't want to have an OJ trial over this car that you guys stole. And of course, somebody else is going into Veronica's cell or interrogation room saying exactly the same thing. Harold's basically going to tell us exactly what we need to know. You can either tell us what happened, and we can be lenient with you, or you can lawyer up. It's your right. In which case, Harold will get the reduced sentence, and you'll be screwed. And Harold and Veronica can't talk to each other. We're in separate areas. We have no ability to coordinate. you can imagine each of us has an incentive to spill the beans. We both would have been better off if we both just kind of shut up. And but you can imagine that what we'll probably do is each one reveal information that hurts the other. Racial tipping is an interesting dynamic. If you look at neighborhoods that very rapidly shifted in Chicago from majority white to majority black in a short time. What was interesting was the neighborhoods that tipped, if you actually polled people ahead of time and asked questions about implicit and explicit racism and so on, those did not predict which neighborhoods tipped. It was really about the structures of the neighborhood and how afraid people were that their housing, that their property values were going to plummet, and that everybody else was going to move out quickly, and they would be the last white person in the neighborhood that hadn't sold yet, and take a beating in terms of the price of their house. And some very interesting literature on racial tipping, which of course also speaks to the way that racism is embedded in the American housing market in a very profound and toxic way. Another kind of game theory often deals with something that are called collective action problems. So we all have an interest. We're all fisher people, and there's a stock of fish out in some place where we're all going to fish. We all have a stake in maintaining the stock of fish there, but each one of us wants to catch a little bit more fish than we're kind of supposed to because we can sell them. And you can, of course, imagine that what we do is we end up depleting the fishery because it's hard to coordinate. That's called the collective action problem. There's lots of examples of that. Then I'll mention public goods. There are things that, like scientific innovations or a clean environment, that we all benefit from, but you sort of say, who's willing to pay the cost of making that thing happen? So, imagine that, we all have a vested interest in developing new cancer treatments. But if I spend a ton of money developing a new cancer treatment and then it's very easily copied by other people, I'm going to spend 100% of the money required to develop that treatment, and I will get a very small fraction of the benefit that comes from that treatment being developed because other people can use that information themselves. And things like patents are an effort to try to deal with that. And also having the government making investments in things that that have very general benefit, but wouldn't particularly benefit any one person who's making the investment. And there's no company that's going to make a huge investment in the fundamentals of quantum mechanics. That would help us down the road with lots of industrial things, but it's the research is so basic that a company would have to make a huge investment without any real reason to think they would get any immediate financial reward for that. By the way, information is a public good. One of the things that's really frustrating for me, I'm a book author, is there's PDF copies of my book out on the web that you can just download and print out. And, of course, you can imagine that makes me grumpy. And, the same thing happens with, the New York Times on the web and so on, where, there's, they try to put up paywalls and things so they can be rewarded for the investment that they made, to produce that news story where their reporter that's been, in Afghanistan for 6 months, got some important information. So you want some more information? Let me give you some other examples. One is the minimum wage and labor laws. There's a very interesting economic literature about the pros and cons of the minimum wage. If you set the minimum wage too high, you're creating a real problem for workers at the very bottom of the economy. If you say minimum wage is $50 an hour, there's a lot of people who are just not going to get hired, if that's really enforced. Other issues that come up that create interesting economic challenges are policies that make it hard to terminate employees when they're not when we haven't thought through what are the full incentive implications of a policy like that. So suppose, for example, that people with disabilities, if you try to terminate someone with disabilities, they have strong protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it's virtually impossible for a person with disabilities who's not hired to sue the person who didn't hire them. So I use a wheelchair or have a mental health challenge that's covered by the ADA. 10 people applied for a job that I'm qualified for, but but I was just not one of the people that was hired. It's very hard for me to prove that my disability was a factor in me not being hired. But if I am hired and I'm terminated, it may be easier for me to sue that company for wrongful termination under the ADA. And so in a weird way, you can imagine that the ADA may actually increase incentives for companies to discriminate. And in fact, there's some empirical evidence that they actually do. And now that doesn't mean the ADA is a bad idea. I think the ADA is one of the most worthy pieces of legislation in my lifetime. But we have to think about what are the structures we need to go with it to deal with the predictable discrimination issues that we might accidentally create. Another issue that's come up that's very similar is ban the box legislation. And I and many other faculty at Crown strongly believe that we should not be, say, barring people from applying to Crown because 10 years ago they committed a crime and were convicted of it. Many of my best colleagues, actually, in my violence prevention work, are people that were involved in homicides and other things, as young people, and they have lived experience that is actually directly pertinent to a lot of the work that we're trying to do, and it's just something that some of my absolute best colleagues are people that have that in their background. We do have to be careful, though, because if you do a ban the box policy, first of all, there's certain jobs, of course, where ban the box makes more sense. If I'm hiring a guy to be a security guard in the armored car and he has a history of theft, of course, it's directly pertinent. But one of the challenges that we also have is that we don't do a very good job of enforcing anti-discrimination laws about general racial profiling in jobs. And we know that young Black men in particular are really discriminated against. And one of the things that we do find in the data, and there's a very discomforting paper by two colleagues of mine, is that when ban the box is implemented, there seems to be an increase in discrimination against young men of color, particularly when they're coming from neighborhoods where there's just a high rate of people that are convicted of crimes. And so something you have to think about with a policy like that. Other kinds of incentive issues. No child left behind. If we're going to strongly reward schools based on the percentage of kids who pass a threshold on their math and reading scores, what's going to happen is schools are going to make a big investment. First of all, they're going to make a big investment on the kids that are kind of near the margin of those math and reading thresholds, because that's where the school can, Harold's currently scoring a 45. I'm rewarded on the basis of the number of kids scoring 50 or above. I'm going to get Harold a tutor and try to get him up to 52. The kid who's got a 30 or the kid who's got a 70, I'm not going to give that kid a tutor as readily, because they're not going to help me move the needle in terms of my own school's ranking, in that no child left behind thing. Also, I'm going to spend a lot more time on math and reading, and it's not so clear I'm going to spend as much time on art and science and gym, things like that. And there's pluses and minuses to the No Child Left Behind law, but you want to understand, what is it incentivizing people to do? They're competitive markets, racism, segregation, and discrimination, and that'll be something that I'll talk about in some future lectures. One of the things that economists have hoped over time is that open competition can remove some forms of racism and discrimination, or that at least can minimize the economic impact of that. And it turns out that, competition can address some forms of discrimination, but not others. It turns out that, for example, if consumers have very discriminatory preferences and don't really want to go into a store that has minoritized, salespeople, there's nothing, we're not going to reduce racism and discrimination by letting the market do its thing. What the market's going to do is it's going to have, all non-Hispanic white people, in those sales jobs, because that's the way that firms are going to make their money. And it's just completely naive to think that a free market is going to be effective in dealing with that problem. There are some other ways that free markets can deal with problems. If you said, I'm going to set up a baseball team and I want all the players to be white, that's not going to work real well. So we'll talk about ways that markets can make worse some forms of discrimination and deal with some others. And also sometimes markets lead to a segregated outcome. So, it turns out that in New York City for a long time, Jews and Italians were not hired by the major law firms in the city. And what was interesting about that, and also Asian Americans, and what was interesting about that, let alone, by the way, African Americans and Latinx folks, what happened was law firms came into existence that were predominantly Black, that were predominantly Jewish, that were predominantly Italian, that were equal quality to the snooty law firms that didn't want to hire those people. And many of their customers were coming from the same communities as the lawyers. So, a lot of businesses that were run by Jews that went to law firms that were largely Jewish lawyers, same with Italians and Latinx and Black folk. Immigration debate. So, by the way, I should say in that example, so the free market did in fact lead to very similar wages across these different groups for the law firms when people were doing the similar work. So, Jewish lawyers in New York were actually getting pretty much the same wages as the Protestant lawyers in the white shoe law firms, but they were segregated. They were not in the same firms. And, so we dealt with the economic inequality aspect of discrimination through a free market, but we did not deal with the segregation and aspect. In terms of immigration, understanding what's the effect on the wages and well-being of native-born workers when we have immigrants who are coming in and doing jobs. And very interesting, contentious debate where there's both winners and losers from immigration. Ironically, some of the biggest losers in immigration, when there's a very open immigration, are the workers who are the closest substitutes for the immigrant laborers. So in fact, if you went, the politics of immigration, say in South Texas, is a little different from what Crown students might expect, because many of the native-born Latinx folks in Texas, are very concerned that they will be the people who will be competing with, with some of the unauthorized residents of the United States that are coming in and being hired by local employers, in construction and roofing and in the agricultural sector and so on. The underground gun markets and game theory. So, my team, we've interviewed gun offenders in Chicago and talked to people about why they carry guns, when they use them, things like that. And one of the things that we were really struck by was how many of the young guys would say stuff like, man, there's just way too many guns out there. And our interviewer would say, well, dude, you're a 22-year-old gang offender who got arrested with an illegal gun. And the person would say, of course I have an illegal gun. All the other guys have guns. I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. And by the way, 47% of the people we interviewed have been wounded by gunfire in their lives. So you say, why you carry a gun? They say, why do you think? And they're sort of stuck in this equilibrium where they're armed up because they're all afraid of each other. Most people in Chicago who are involved in, say, drug selling or gang activity, they don't want to hurt anybody. They're trying to be safe, and they're trying to earn a livelihood. They're trying to be safe, keep their families safe. And sometimes they feel that having a gun is an important part of that. And that's just a real challenge. And then signaling games are another interesting thing. So signaling games are really where we're trying, there's something about you that's really important that I need to know, but I can't directly see it. I have to infer it from your behavior or some things that you say that kind of give me a hint about your underlying values. So you're a Crown student and you don't know Harold Pollack, and you really don't know what my attitudes say are about race or about LGBTQ plus equality, other issues that are really important. And you have to decide how much you trust me as I teach this economics class when I'm teaching about things that impinge on those issues. So one of the things that you pay attention to is what are the things that I say, because I know that you're trying to figure out what my values are. So if I say something, suppose there's something that the only people who would say it are people who are willing to have other people believe that they're a little bit racist or a little bit homophobic, and then I choose to say that thing anyway. Well, you're going to draw the logical conclusion to that. And so the result is that there's certain things that are not going to be said. And by the way, that's good in general. I actually think one of the things, there's an assumption that political correctness is always bad. I think the idea that we don't say things because they may offend people or denigrate other people's humanity, that's good. But there are times when there's an issue that has some ambiguity to it, where we actually would like to have a more nuanced discussion, but nobody wants to be the person raising the icky issue. And you can see how we end up in a situation where nobody's talking about the issue, except for people who don't mind that other people think that they're racist or something like that. If anybody's familiar with, say, William Julius Wilson's career and some of the issues that he got involved in, where he was just trying to talk about some of the obvious issues that were going on in low-income communities of color, where there was a high rate of interpersonal violence among young people, things like that. It was very challenging, sensitive subjects. And in every community, by the way, there's things that we also say inside the group that we don't say in a public way, in part because of these kinds of issues. So just who I am, I won't say too much about me because that's not that interesting, but I spent most of my childhood in Rochester, New York, but also New Jersey, Boston, New Haven, Ann Arbor. I'm a public health researcher, mostly on urban topics, ranging from the opioid epidemic to HIV prevention and crime, things like that. I used to joke that I study heart-wrenching topics in mathematical ways and then draw sweeping policy conclusions that don't follow from the models. Most of my recent work is actually very direct intervention work. I don't do so much modeling compared to the beginning of my career. If you see me in the lobby, I'm fair game to approach with a question. Really, in that moment, I may have to tell you, hey, let's find a better time to talk, but I really want you to reach out to me if you're having a challenge. Now, please reach out to me in a timely way. If there's a homework assignment that's due in 2 hours, that's, I'm not always going to be able to say, okay, I'm going to stop everything and be able to help you. So, my schedule is a Superfund site. So I sometimes need a long, you have to arrange things, so that it fits in my schedule. I should tell you that I am terrible with names. And as I get older, I'm getting worse with names. And also I have some vision issues. So please make a name card and always bring it to class so that I can do that. And I will remember your 5th grade teacher was left-handed, and I'll forget your name. And just please do not, please forgive me for that. That's just, that's a challenge that I have. Readings. Microeconomics by Krugman and Wells, the 6th edition, is the official textbook for the course. It actually doesn't matter which edition of the book you use. Old editions of the book, totally fine. It's a well-written book. It's got pretty intuitive stuff. Krugman was actually, he's a New York Times columnist and a Princeton professor. Actually, he's now moved over to City University of New York. He and I squabbled during the 2008 campaign. We sort of made up now. I'll be making lecture videos like this one for you to watch. And also I'll be having interviews with various other economic policy people, and I'll have links to podcasts, often from NPR's Planet Money. One of the things I want you to do every week is look in the paper and look on the news for things that relate to the week's material. Every single week, the stuff that we do is all around us, and so keep your eye out for things that you're seeing in the news that that relate to the material. And you'll see there's this in the assignments. I'm hoping there'll be a mixture in the assignments of here's the mechanics that you have to learn from the chapter. Here's something in the real world where I want you to relate what was said in the chapter to to this contemporary issue. Maybe it's two people arguing in public about the minimum wage or something like that. This is just, I take a lot of pictures. I was flying over Soldier Field on the way to Midway. So I took this picture straight down. So it's my overview slide. So I mentioned the requirements. We have weekly problem sets, 3 or 4 students. You can work together hand in one problem set. Everybody's responsible for every problem on the midterm and the final. So you can free ride within your group. And of course, I have no way to know that. That's not going to be great when you sit down on the exams. But please, as your group, do the work with professionalism and integrity. By the way, and write clearly, present, don't hand in a problem set that looks like you wrote it on a washcloth on the, on the metro on the way to class. And cite all sources that you use, human or non-human, when you're doing the work. We have in-class exams. There's no calculus or complicated algebra in the class. Lots of stuff with straight line graphs, working with proportional changes and percentages, areas of triangles and squares. These are actually key life skills to restamp your math visa if it's been a while. I'll say, by the way, this is a policy-oriented course in microeconomics. I'm not going to say too much about macroeconomics, recessions, things like that. I won't say too much about inflation, the money supply. Alan Greenspan probably was the most famous chairman of the Federal Reserve in recent years. My mom actually went on a date with him in 1952, claims that she would not have gone on a second date with him, even knowing his future success. But such is life. What am I going to do in the course? We're basically going to march through the textbook. Starting with, Polonius. Polonius was a character in Hamlet. You can Google Polonius. We're going to start with today's lecture on these generalities. Then we're going to talk about supply and demand analysis. That's just bedrock. Supply curves, demand curves, what they are, where they come from. Elasticity and its application. That's really how sensitive are producers and how sensitive are consumers to changes in various things. How sensitive, if I raise the price of gas a little bit, will producers provide more gasoline? Will consumers buy a lot less gasoline? Those are elasticity questions. If the price of a key input goes up, how do producers respond to that? That's also an elasticity question. Substitutes and complements and how they relate to what we call cross-price elasticities or cross-price sensitivities. So peanut butter and jelly, they're complements. If the price of jelly goes up, people consume less peanut butter because those things kind of go together. Substitutes, if we have, Chicago Bulls tickets and Chicago Bears tickets. If the price if a Bears ticket becomes more expensive, it's gonna increase the demand for both tickets, because there's people like, I want to see a sporting event. This one's too expensive. So the price of a Bulls game will actually go up if the price of a Bears game goes up. And those are substitutes. And you can think about, if we have different kinds of workers, are substitutes and complements. If we have lots of, let's say that because of immigration, there's lots of low-wage workers available in the construction industry. That's going to reduce the wage that someone who wants to be a construction worker is going to get, because they're competing with these low-wage workers. It may actually increase the wage of construction managers, because they can deploy this this workforce in a way that may be more lucrative. Consumer and producer surplus. That's how much do consumers and how much do producers benefit from a particular market. The supply curve, where it comes from, that's really at a given price, how much will suppliers be willing to provide? That's what the supply curve is. The demand curve is at a given price, how much are consumers willing to buy? And that comes from a couple of things. One is how much consumers like the product. And the other is, what are the alternatives to that product? Consumers may like, Chicagoans may like football just fine, but if you said, I'm going to charge $2,000 for a Bears ticket, people are like, well, I'm just going to go to, Bulls game instead, or I'll go to I'll go to Indianapolis and watch an NFL game there, or Green Bay. There, in general, when there's lots of close substitutes, consumers are very price elastic. They're very sensitive to the price. You just cannot raise the price of something. If I have a bagel store and I say I'm going to charge $8 for bagels, that kind of doesn't work because there's too many substitutes that people can find, including another bagel store. Markets and efficiency. Markets sometimes lead to really admirably efficient outcomes. And there's this idea of the invisible hand, where markets allow us to coordinate in a remarkable way. The shirt that I'm wearing, is remarkably cheap because, there's a very competitive market for shirts that can provide me with a shirt for $8, that I like. Markets don't make everything efficient. Sometimes the invisible hand is invisible because it isn't there, as the Nobel-winning economist Joe Stiglitz liked to say. Monopoly and oligopoly. We'll talk about that. And somehow the price of a shirt is a little different from the price of Microsoft Office, because Microsoft has real market power. It costs Microsoft $0 to give you another copy of Microsoft Office, but they can charge a lot for it because you kind of need it. If your colleagues are emailing you files in Excel and Word, you kind of need to buy it. What the monopolist does is the monopolist creates a shortage of something so they can charge a high price, so that they can, and one of the consequences of that is there's a bunch of people who would benefit from the product much more than it would actually cost to provide them the product, but the producer doesn't want to lower the price, so that they can get it, because there's lots of people willing to pay a lot more. And one of the interesting things that we'll talk about is if I could charge the more price sensitive customers less and charge them the least elastic customers more, maybe there's a way I can work around that as a monopolist. And probably the most obvious example of that is on the airplane. So I'm actually in a hotel room in Paris right now, and on the way over I had a basic economy seat. I was only allowed one carry-on, and I was the last person on the plane, and I could see way up in the front of the plane there were people they were giving them warm towels, and they could get on the plane first. They had all kinds of little goodies that I didn't have, and they paid a lot more money to get on that flight. That's called price discrimination. And in the airline case, by the way, I think that's fine. It's not always fine if we're talking about something where there might be some broader social implication. The effect of taxes and government regulation. One issue that is really important is who actually pays a tax. So that's called the tax incidence. If I force a supplier to pay a big tax on a particular good, so let's say I put in a carbon tax on producers, they're going to pass some of that tax on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And it depends on what we'll see is that when you put on a tax, generally the least elastic side of the market ends up bearing most of that tax. Market failures is a justification for public intervention. If there's public goods, if there's other things, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about discrimination, and we'll talk about government failures too. We live in the state of Illinois. There's lots of government failures. When I was recently trying to help a loved one get a COVID vaccine, and some of the public information sources were so far inferior to that of like a replacement level Domino's Pizzas franchise, you have to say, wow, government is really doing a bad job in this very important activity that's pretty basic that the private companies seem to be handling very well. So some initial insights. This is their slide. What 4 principles guide the choices made by individuals, and how, and the principles about how individual choices interact, and how do we think about economy-wide interactions. Here's another overview slide. Yeah, that's not from the same flight, but pretty much same picture. So what are some principles that we want to talk about? One is that choices are necessary because resources are scarce. Now, resources, anything that can be used to produce something else. And could be money, could also be your time, could be some natural resource, could be your attention. You know, one of the challenges we have now in the age of the smartphone and the app is our attention is one of the scarce resources. You know, right now I'm competing with whatever whatever you got going on your phone while you're also having my lecture on in the background. Opportunity cost. The true cost of something is what you must give up to get it. That's opportunity cost. So, you know, Mark Zuckerberg understood the concept of opportunity cost and then dropped out of Harvard. This is one of their class slides too. I might add, that's kind of too bad, but that would be another story. Maybe the society would have preferred that he stayed in Harvard and became an ophthalmologist. Tiger Woods and Kobe Bryant have SAT scores that were kind of like mine. So it's kind of too bad that they lost the chance to be professors, but they probably figured that there was something else they could do that might be more lucrative. How do we think about decisions and the idea that how much decisions are decisions at the margin, and how we trade off the costs and benefits of doing one thing rather than another? And most of those trade-offs that we do in our real life as policy professionals are kind of how much questions. You know, if you took a job with the mayor of Chicago, she's probably not going to ask you, could you write me a memo explaining whether Head Start is good or bad? That's not helpful. And we kind of know that Head Start is good. But she might say, you know, we have another $5 million in the budget we didn't expect to have. Should we spend it on some more Head Start services, or should we spend it on some more disability services for Chicago third graders? We know that overall disability services are good, Head Start is good. Where would that $5 million do the most good at the margin? And that is not the answer to that question is not obvious. You know, you got to really look at the two programs and say, well, here's what we would do if we could do a little bit more in Head Start or a little bit more with disability services. So those are decisions at the margin, and that's most of what we're doing in policy analysis. So a marginal decision is a little bit more or a little bit less of that activity. By those of you that studied calculus, you could see that this is where derivatives sometimes come in, and you know, in the mathematical formalism that people do in you know, when they really try to write down all the X's and O's in complicated situations. Incentives. People respond imperfectly to incentives. People are trying to make themselves better off. An incentive is anything that offers a reward to people who change their behavior in some way. And we really want to understand incentives when we're trying to make policies, because if because how people respond to our policy will have a huge amount to do with whether that policy is successful. So you know, imagine that we're trying to reduce pollution. One thing we could do is we could educate manufacturers about climate change, or we could offer them a financial reward for reducing their pollution. Presumably the second is going to have a bigger impact, particularly because they already know a lot of the stuff about climate change. One of the disturbing things for those of you that follow the climate change debate is there's nobody that knows more about climate change than the geophysicists at the major oil companies. You know, they know that. They've been studying that for years. It's not in their economic interest as a company to be fully transparent about what they know. But if you look at like the design of some of the big oil facilities, they've actually gamed out how climate change would affect the safety of that oil rig and things like that. Now, incentives come in different forms. There's monetary incentives, but there's also non-monetary incentives that matter very often dramatically. And there's status rewards. And I must say, in our work on violence prevention, that's actually really important, because we often think that young people are behaving in a way that's not rational when they're actually responding to uh, to incentives in a way that we just don't understand as outsiders. And sometimes those incentives are strategic, and I'll get to that in a minute, but sometimes they're also things like how I think about myself. So imagine that that we have a seventh grader, uh, who's walking home from school, and a ninth grader who's larger gets into it with them and is humiliating them and over some minor thing. That seventh grader is being bullied, and they respond to that bullying by getting into a fight with this larger person, and they get hurt. And um, I sort of have this instinct, like, why did you do that? That seems very irrational. No, somebody might say, well, I mean, there might be some very practical reasons why they wanted to fight, and I'll get to that in another slide. But it could just be, my honor's at stake, and I would prefer for myself, my own identity, I would rather get my butt kicked by this bigger kid than to have that person, than to let myself be humiliated in that way. And there's nothing irrational about that at all. And that is, and we're all that way. And we want to respect that and understand that there's a non-monetary incentive, or to defend my honor. And the other thing is, people don't understand a lot of incentives in many important situations. So, my mom is on Social Security. She's 90 years old, and she gets all this really complicated stuff, about her benefits. And the standard joke that I tell is, for faster service, please press or say your IP address. And very often people don't respond to incentives that public programs create because the incentives are not communicated in a clear and actionable way. And either people don't have full information about it, people don't understand it, maybe don't trust the source of information for lots of reasonable reasons. One of the things that we talk about quite a bit is the idea of creating a choice architecture for people that allows people to respond to incentives in a reasonable way. I should say this, by when I was 22 years old, I remember getting stuff from my retirement plan, and it was like complicated and boring. And I never put any money into my retirement plan because in one way, it was on me. I didn't spend the 45 minutes required to really understand it. But I actually lost a lot of money because I really didn't start saving in my life until I was much older, basically because I didn't want to read a boring piece of paperwork from when I was starting out as an engineer. And the way that things were set up was, if you didn't specifically go out and sign up for the retirement benefit, they just didn't put any money into your 401k. And that's a bad choice architecture that unfortunately now has been changed in most places. Now, one corollary I would offer is, when people behave in a way that seems grossly irrational, very often that means we don't understand the incentives and constraints that they're really operating under. And I'll give another example involving young people. So we've got a ninth grader walking down the hallway at Fenger High School on the far south side of Chicago. 10th grader steps on his sneaker. And they're just walking, in opposite directions on the way to different classes. The ninth grader loudly tells him to F off and gives him a big shove, and ends up getting in trouble because from the gray-haired professor dude perspective, he overreacted to this guy stepping on his shoe. If somebody stepped on my shoe in the hallway at the Crown School, I would be assuming that they're sort of checking their phone and they're just not paying attention. But the ninth grader says, no, you don't understand. I'm in that hallway. There's all these other kids watching. And if I allow myself to be punked like that, I won't be safe. I've got to walk home. People cannot feel like they can do that to me without consequence. because I won't be safe. And, you dweeby Mr. Professor, that's not the life that you live. And, you are physically safe in a different way than I am, as a ninth grader in this environment. One of the things that I find very poignant in my violence prevention work is how, I am this dweeby, nerdy professor, and a lot of the boys are kind of fascinated that I'm an adult man, adult cisgender man, who is not physically imposing in any way, and that and that I can go through my life without that being a salient factor, in a way that they're not in an environment that allows that. By some of the best economists of everyday life are social workers and sociologists like Irving Goffman and Elijah Anderson, who really have studied the presentation of self in everyday life. In the case of Irving Goffman, also has a wonderful book, Stigma, and Elijah Anderson, who has a wonderful book called Streetwise, that talks about just how people navigate their daily environments. Now, I should say, by the way, people respond imperfectly in lots of ways that also reflect the intersection of psychology and economics. And, we're all, one of the ironies of life is we are all so much better at buying breakfast cereal than we are at picking marriage partners. And particularly if you think about rare, scary, or salient outcomes and possibilities, that's really hard for us to process. But let me give you an example. Suppose that, this is not me, but suppose that I had diabetic retinopathy, and I go to an eye surgeon, and the eye surgeon says to me, well, you've got diabetic retinopathy, and we've got this surgery that we can do. It's got a 95% chance that's really going to improve your vision and halt the deterioration. It's got a 4.95% probability that it's not going to work, and it's actually going to make your vision, it's kind of going to accelerate the deterioration some, because we're messing with your eye. And there's a 0.05% probability that actually during the surgery itself, your eyeball kind of pops out of the socket, and it sort of dangles down, and there's this, and it sort of dangles there, and then there's this brown fluid that comes down on your cheek and kind of makes a little stain there, and we actually have to put the eyeball back into the socket, and you'll have this sort of weird mark on your cheek where the fluid was there, and now if I'm presented with that, of course, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a ton of time like, what do you mean your eyeball kind of falls out of the socket? Like, how does that even happen? Like, what's it dangling by? And what's the fluid? That sounds like, is there a hole in my eyeball that's making that happen? Like, what's, and the fact that what I really should be thinking about is that 95% versus the 4.95% in terms of, that's what really actually matters. But they've given me this incredibly vivid, scary, gross thing that's also so tactile that it's going to, of course, occupy my attention. But a lot of stereotypes and heuristics, of course, resonate with the kind of examples that I'm describing. And there's just a ton of evidence that we regard vivid outcomes as more likely, and we often underestimate the importance of mundane risks. So, let's say I'm worried about the potential cancer-causing impacts of overhead power lines. So it's like, well, let's all meet at Burger King for Impossible Whoppers and talk about the radiation dangers of our, the power line. And obviously, the Impossible Whopper is actually more, although that's my favorite fast food. It's probably more dangerous than anything that's coming out of that power line. Okay. Another transition slide as a bridge in New York City. Let me talk about gains from trade some. We're not going to do too much with trade in the course, but I think it's important to lay out a few things about it. So, so one thing is trade allows us to consume more than we could consume if we were just autark, in an autonomous situation, not dealing with other people. So there are gains from trade that result from our ability to specialize in the things that we are good at. So, and that's called comparative advantage. That's true in our domestic economy, and that's also true globally, although there's lots of normative consequences when we have this kind of trading that have to be thought about and addressed. So just one obvious thing. So workers in rural China earn much lower hourly wages than Chicagoans do. And having these Chinese workers producing and selling labor-intensive products to Chicagoans allows some really serious gains from trade. That's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. There's no question that overall, if you say what has reduced infant mortality in the world over the past 2 centuries, the rise of the Chinese economy, one of the absolute best things that's happened. And same is true in India, Vietnam, and so on. I'm making this recording on an Apple computer that many of whose components were produced by fairly low wage Chinese workers who benefited from this, and I'm benefiting from the work that they did. Now, I should say that the same trade patterns caused economic harm to many, many working class people in the wealthy nations. And in fact, if you look at the economic impact of globalization, many of the studies say basically every group in the entire globe has benefited with one exception, which is working class people in wealthy nations, who are the closest substitutes to a lot of the workers, the Chinese workers and others that I'm talking about. And this also speaks to a larger point that markets are driving actually towards economic efficiency, but that process is very unsentimental and causes some real human harm. And so markets sometimes, but very far from always, promote desirable distributional outcomes or social justice. If you really want a particular social justice outcome or a distributional outcome, you can't rely on the market by itself to produce that. You have to engage in concerted policy action to make sure that that happens. Markets move towards equilibrium because people respond to incentives. That's going to happen. And equilibrium is the situation where no individual would be better off by doing something different without making someone else worse off, basically. So there's I'm selling widgets. There's a price at which everybody who wants to buy a widget at that price can buy it, and everyone who wants to sell a widget at that price can sell it. And that's called the market clearing price and equilibrium. We'll get to that in the next lecture. There's also different kinds of equilibrium. I mentioned the sort of political correctness issues, and I have some examples below. And I should also mention that equilibria don't always match the preferences of any individual. And the racial tipping example is one where in Chicago, we got very dramatic racial tipping that most people really were very, very sorry to see, but didn't know how to address the process. There's a ton of people that moved from Woodlawn to Skokie who said, well, that was just really sad that happened. I don't know how it could have been prevented. And I certainly don't know how I myself as an individual could have done much given all the broader things that were happening. And there's a blame the game, not the player aspect to that we created a situation where we have local school funding, local school districts, very poor enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, government redlining. We created this situation where as a society and in policy, that really accelerated many of these processes. And obviously SSA 300 and other courses provide more information about that than I'm going to be able to do now. But the fact that there was an equilibrium that was very highly segregated did not mean that that's what people really wanted in that situation. Although it may be that enough people preferred that to a more just equilibrium that it was hard to get policy action. So I don't want to completely absolve everybody from their human agency in those. And Ta-Nehisi Coates's essay, Case for Reparations, has a lot about the west side of Chicago and how that happened that I highly recommend. Resources should generally be used efficiently to achieve society's goals. So an economy is efficient if it's taken all opportunities to make some people better off without making others worse off. I'm not actually a huge zealot around efficiency. Sometimes we identify something as inefficient and it's still the right way we should arrange things. So, you sometimes hear people say, you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I've never understood that argument. If Paul really needs the money and Peter doesn't, maybe robbing Peter isn't the right thing to do, but taxing Peter to pay Paul makes a lot of sense. And, we all have to have each other's backs through social insurance that in any given moment sometimes means it may look like, Harold Pollack is paying higher taxes so that someone on Medicaid can get essential services that they need. It may look in that moment like Harold's being made worse off. Well, Harold benefits from having a system where everybody's needs are met. And, my family was protected from bankruptcy after my mother-in-law died suddenly, and her son, who's disabled, moved into our house because all of a sudden we benefited from Medicaid. And so there's a complexity to that. But efficiency is certainly one value that we are trying to promote. And the fact that there are many outcomes that are inefficient but are valuable from an equity perspective does not mean that all outcomes that are inefficient have the same justification. There's plenty of stupid policies that are inefficient that actually are not creating a more just outcome. So let me just go into a little bit more detail on this. So this is largely their slide. I must say it's a little bit, obviously we could have an entire, political philosophy volume on this, but equity is something where everyone's getting their fair share, having their needs met. And equity and efficiency are sometimes at odds. Markets often lead to efficiency. I say I was taught implicitly when I was trained in economics that most of the time markets lead to efficiency, and they occasionally have failures. And those occasional failures required government intervention. I think that argument was always a little fatuous, especially if you think about climate change. Well, markets, they usually are efficient, but we are burning up the planet because markets don't deal with, create too much incentives to pollute. Well, that's kind of profound. There's another than that, Mrs. Lincoln, the play was great aspect to that. People normally take opportunities to make themselves better off. That's an important insight. But in the case of market failures, the pursuit of self-interest, as I said, can make society worse off, and government has to intervene. And the most obvious thing is people can. There may be a cheaper production process that creates a lot of pollution. That's what firms are going to do if they can get away with it. But there are others too, and we'll talk about that. Classic market failures include monopoly, where the monopolist has a big incentive to create a shortage so they can charge a high price, and also information problems. Philip Morris was not going to tell people that the tar in cigarettes is highly lethal and that the nicotine is highly addictive. So consumers were not in a position to fully evaluate the risks and benefits of continuing to consume combustible tobacco. So those are classic market failures. There's other failures of markets that actually are not considered by economists to be market failures, but that are very serious ways that markets create injustices or problems for the society. So, if consumers are extremely homophobic, and retail stores do not hire LGBTQ plus people to be salespeople, that's not a classic market failure. That is the firm responding to customers. What it is it's a social justice failure, and it's a social failure of the market. And we can't think about that as, is this efficient or non-efficient? It's really just, no, it's just people, the market is rewarding behavior that mistreats people, and we can't allow that. And we know that housing markets often perpetuate discrimination and so on. There are some gray zone cases where we don't quite know what to label it. So like I look at the Robinhood app, which I think is just really scary and dangerous. It's gamifying investments, encouraging people to do things that don't make any sense if you're actually knowledgeable about investing, but also create some real risks. There's been suicides where young people there was a very tragic case where someone thought that he had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars of his family's money and he killed himself. And I mentioned cigarettes, this sort of thing. People that manufacture fentanyl that has created a public health catastrophe. We can call those market failures, but they're really I'm not sure that that's the term that I would really want to use. Now, I should say on the flip side, I do think, particularly among progressives, there's sometimes a blind side to many of the policies that one might favor from a progressive perspective that are grossly inefficient, often have very serious problems. First of all, they become much more expensive and hard to sustain if they're very inefficient, but also they often have equity issues that are reflected in those inefficiencies. So, if people are making very heavy use of environmental regulations to try to prevent high density housing from being built, that's inefficient, but you sort of say, okay, and by the way, who's benefiting from that? It's very often very well organized and affluent people who are making housing more expensive for people who are less affluent. And the sort of not in my backyard problem is an example that rent control policies have had some very serious consequences, not only in terms of inefficiency, but in terms of fairness, where we see that people who are not economically needy are able to stay in a rent controlled apartment and pay a very low rent. And there's some very serious equity consequences of that. Now, I want to give some caveat to market failures, which is that non-market institutions also have characteristic failures, sometimes for very distinctive reasons, sometimes for overlapping reasons. And one reason is that government, there are power differentials that matter, and constituencies that are powerful and well organized can use government to get what they want, and sometimes they use government to block market transactions that would be more equitable and more efficient. And so one of the things I'm actually very interested in, the internment of Japanese Americans and Nisei in the Second World War. And as a person of a Jewish background, there were so many aspects of that story that resonated with me. One of the things that was really striking was some of the most prominent supporters of the internment were the direct economic competitors to Japanese American farmers in California. It turns out that many of the recent immigrants or Japanese Americans who were in farming were very effective competitors, and they would do things like set up roadside stands where they would sell fruits and vegetables, and were just effective producers, and their competitors wanted to stop them from doing that, and lobbied for not only the internment but also ways that people's property was taken, and just profound injustice and crimes committed against people that were part of the internment. And in that case, if the market by itself was actually again leading to a much better outcome, than people use the tools of government to create fundamental injustice, particularly in that case because there really was no national security issue at stake. German Americans were not interned, and there was a high element of racism there. Jim Crow laws were very much designed in the South to prevent Black workers from being trained in lucrative occupations where they would compete with white workers, to legally punish firms that tried to hire Black workers for these jobs. If you think about it, firms had a big incentive, since Black workers had lower wages. They had a big incentive to try to hire Black workers to do a lot of these roles, and basically the purpose of the Jim Crow laws in part was to prevent that from happening. And, in this particular case, it wasn't that, we often sort of think of evil capital doing bad things to labor. In this particular case, it was also sort of, the white workers in the labor force who got laws passed to prevent capital from doing something that would have created a more just outcome. Also, of course, bureaucratic failures, government agencies just don't always work well, and also also organizations that are a little bit at the boundary. Some, think about the too big to fail problem. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were sort of played a key role in the American mortgage market, leading to the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And there was a sense that they were just so big that they couldn't be allowed to fail, and that led to all kinds of problems. Government agencies that face limited competition often are sluggish, sclerotic. If you're a small pizza franchise, if you cannot find efficient ways to serve your consumers, you will be out of business. If you are a local government agency, you don't have that same immediate mechanism of accountability, and that matters. I won't say too much about recessions, but I will say sometimes the demand in the economy for goods and services drops to a point where resources lay unused, and that's a special kind of market failure, and that's really what recession is. There's workers who are unemployed who are willing to work at lower wages than workers are currently being paid, but employers will not hire them at that lower wage to do the work. And there's a variety of interesting reasons for that. We'll say a little bit about that at the end of the course, but just this idea that there's this macroeconomic process where somehow the overall demand for goods and services gets to be too low, and the government has to intervene to shore that up, is important. And that's really what this point is here, and that's the great insight. John Maynard Keynes, was probably the first person to articulate that in its modern formulation, that the government has to manage the overall demand for goods and services in the economy sometimes when COVID hits or there's a financial crisis. And I won't say too much about that. And I just put this bird in because I kind of like it. I like taking bird pictures. Increases in the economy's potential lead to economic growth over time. So new technologies are really important. I should say, by the way, new technology is sometimes, new scientific advance, the invention of the transistor, something like that. Sometimes a new technology is an organizational technology. Walmart and Amazon are more efficient ways to distribute products to the public. That's a real technological innovation at the Amazon distribution system. That's just as much of a technological innovation as as the invention of a new microchip or something like that. Of course, there are winners and losers when these advances occur. And you can imagine, for example, in the case of energy, imagine that we have a breakthrough in solar power. That could that'll create huge benefits, but there will also be some pain caused to communities that rely on coal mining, things like that. And one of the challenges we have is, how do we compensate the losers when things happen that need to happen, but that bring human cost to them? Some distinction to keep in mind: models versus reality, positive and normative analysis. An economic model, really any model, studies real-world behavior by simplifying and sometimes oversimplifying. One of the phrases I like is, all models are wrong, some models are useful. And models are good because they help us from getting lost in the details so that we can focus on basic mechanisms. The supply and demand curves, they're basic mechanisms. If I'm sitting and I'm sort of saying, I want to understand how long it's going to take for this plug thing, if I just drop it, how long is it going to take to hit the ground? High school physics do a pretty good job at that. And if I get all bogged down, well, there's some air turbulence that's going to get underneath this thing as it's falling, and I really have to model the fluid dynamics in the atmosphere of this rapidly moving object with this particular shape moving through, you can imagine that, wow, that's going to get incredibly deep in the weeds. And now if I'm designing, I used to be an aerospace engineer. If you're talking about a rocket that's going to be fired, that's going to go from here to the moon, well, you got to actually, analyze that stuff. But wow, that's very often, we need a simplified model that gets to the basics and not allow the complexity to just create, endless confusion. So now I must say, as economic theory develops, very often you're bringing in new complexities that we ignored in the simplest model. So, I'm trying to understand the supply and demand, what determines workers' wages for particular jobs. My initial cut at it is very simplified. And then maybe my next cut says, well, but people also really value people who want to get a job as a park ranger or, work in the special forces. They really value the mission. And so you can pay those people a slightly lower wage than you otherwise would because they think the work is so important. You can imagine you start to layer in new complexities that might, that become important. They're positive versus normative. I would say most economic models are really good at the positive side, just this is what's going to happen, versus the normative side, which is this is how things should be. And I think the normative structure of economics is often pretty incomplete when we're trying to think about the full moral political landscape that that's in place for a lot of really important public policies. We can do an economic analysis of the case for reparations, for example, that would say, okay, here's some policies, here's how much they're likely to cost, and here's going to benefit, who's going to not benefit from that. If you say, is this policy good for the society? Is it creating a more just outcome? That's not really for economists to elaborate. That's then, there's a whole set of normative questions there that that economics is not the tool to embrace. And so we want to separate those things out. They're both positive and normative analyses are incredibly important. First of all, your normative analysis is a lot better if you actually have accurate predictions of what's actually going to happen. But they're both important, but economics in general is more directly pertinent to the positive side. And it's often a very valuable input to the normative side, but it doesn't directly tell you the answer. So I've already mentioned people face trade-offs and resources are scarce. We want to understand those trade-offs. Should you come to class or should you watch VH1's World's Dumbest Videos? There's a trade-off there. I understand that. It's just a reality. I've already mentioned opportunity cost. I won't mention it again, but I put this up as a second slide just so that to underscore this is important. That's just an eagle that I took at Starved Rock. And rational people think at the margin. I mentioned this before. Let me give you a more interesting example of thinking at the margin than that Head Start one that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. Let's suppose that United Airlines runs a Chicago to New York flight. And that flight, each time the flight takes off, there's $20,000 in labor, fuel, and capital costs. That's going to be the same $20,000 whether that flight is full or empty. That's just, you gotta have the crew on there. You've got to have you've got to power the plane. But then each passenger costs an additional $15 because they give you peanuts and for baggage handling. And maybe there's the weight of the passengers also affects the fuel economy and so on. So the plane has 200 seats. So the average cost per passenger is at least $115, right? Because 20,000 divided by 200, that's $100. So the fixed cost of the flight, we got $100 right there. And then and if we have the whole thing full, we're also paying $15 extra for each passenger to have some peanuts and some baggage handling. Now, United charges $300 for the flight for tickets booked in advance, because of course they're trying to make money on the flight. So I'm a student. I don't have a ticket, but just before flight time, I sort of show up and I say, you know what? I'm willing to take $75. I'm going to pay you $75 if you'll take me for that seat that's otherwise going to be empty. Now, what should United Airlines do? Sort of an interesting question, and I want you to think about that. Should they take the $75? Think about how you'd answer that question. Average versus marginal costs. So in this particular United example, I said the average cost per passenger is at least $115, but in some sense, the marginal cost is $15. Each additional passenger that comes on, we're going to spend another $15. Okay. So let's think about the different kinds of costs that firms have, organizations have. So let's suppose that I have some function, I'll call that total cost of, it's a function of Q. Okay, so this is TC of Q. So given any Q, it'll give me a value of this. And I should say it could be to consume or produce Q units of that thing. So let's say I spend $1 million to produce 100 cars. I'm a Ford plant or something. So my average cost is my total cost of Q divided by Q. So it's $1 million divided by 100, which is $10,000. Now the marginal cost is how much would my cost go up if I just consumed a little more? What's the slope of that total cost curve? So here it's just the total cost if I have Q plus 1 minus the total cost if I only have Q. And I'm going to make it per unit. So I'm dividing by 1. And if I have some little h, suppose I didn't go up by a full 1, I just went up by some small amount h, you can imagine I could compute the slope this way. So it's the cost per unit at the margin. If I just do a little more, and those of you that do calculus will understand that's the derivative of total cost with respect to Q, but you don't need to know that for this class. Okay. So now marginal cost, one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about in economics is how does that marginal cost of Q, how does that change with Q? So suppose, for example, I have a fixed learning curve. I have a learning curve for building cars, or maybe I've just got a lot of infrastructure costs and stuff. Typically, it costs me a lot more to produce my 100th car than it did to produce my first car. And very often we see the declining marginal cost. I get more efficient as I produce more. Now, it's not always true. I might hit a bottleneck, and then marginal costs can start to really rise as I get near my total capacity. Now, so for example, suppose I'm a farmer and I'm trying to produce more crops. I produce a lot of corn, and then all of a sudden the demand for corn goes out of sight, and I start to just try to produce as much corn as I can. I start trying to plant corn in the parts of my field that are the worst land. And it actually becomes very costly for me to produce some corn over at that spot that I've never watered. So you could see that the marginal cost might actually start to go up if I'm having to reach out into those, into those sort of unproductive parts of my farmland. There's also the notion of a fixed cost. That's what's your total cost if you're not producing anything, you're just getting started. So, United has to buy the plane before they got any revenue at all from any passengers. And that's the total cost when Q is 0. That's what this is. So that's the fixed cost. This, by the way, keep this under your hat. We'll use it later. Should you come to class today? Well, the average cost of class is pretty high, given you have to take your tuition and divide by the number of class sessions. But you'll incur that cost whether you come or not. The marginal cost is really, well, I've got train fare to come here, plus the value of my time is worth something. Marginal cost is a little lower, I hope. And I hope that it's justified. Here's an example for you to think about. So my current cell phone contract, let's say, cost me $50 a month and then cost me 30 cents for every minute over 500 minutes in a month. And right now, under this plan, I spend $80 a month. Okay. Now I'm offered a flat rate plan of $80 a month that has unlimited calling. Is this a good deal or a bad deal for me? Or is it basically, doesn't matter. It's the same as what I've got right now because I'm already spending $80 a month. Think about that question. Why is this actually a good deal for me? It's a better deal, unambiguously better deal than what I've got right now. Think about why that's true. Another way that average and marginal costs can be important is when we think about institutional change. And I'll give you one example that is really important in my own life. You know, my wife and I take care of a brother, he's disabled. The example of deinstitutionalization. So let's suppose it's 1970. Our psychiatric institution costs $10 million a year to operate, and it's got 100 inpatients. That's $100,000 per patient. And many of those patients, they don't need to be there. They're sort of sitting there playing cards in the break room. And you're saying, why is this guy in an institution? Why don't we, and it's $100,000 per patient. Why don't we transition 20 patients to the community and then use some of the money that we've saved to finance community-based services, right? If we took 100,000 per patient and we multiplied by 20 patients, that's $2 million. Wow, you could do a lot of community-based services for that. Now, what's right and wrong about this argument from a human perspective and from an economic perspective? I'll just say to telegraph it, absolutely the right human argument, problematic economic argument. You might want to think about why. People are mostly rational. As I mentioned, we're much better at buying cereal than we are at deciding who to marry, what house to buy, whether or not to have that more effective, but also more intrusive and scary cancer surgery. We learn from practice. Markets also help us make certain kinds of decisions, but not others. There's actually a lot of ways that if I'm trying to buy breakfast cereal, that market mechanisms can help me with that. We're bad at weighing small probabilities or large risks and benefits. We're not good at thinking about the future. And we just have psychological lives that are rich, that lead us astray. And behavioral economics is really the study of that. I think, by the way, there's some really nice ties between the behavioral economics literature and some of the stuff that you might be learning in your other classes. There's a really nice literature on administrative burden that Don Moynihan and Pam Hurd have recently written a classic book about that really resonates with so much of my work. I'll give you an example in the disability space. So SSI, Supplemental Security Income, has an asset limit. Recipients, they can't have more than $2,000 in countable financial assets. By the way, this limit was last raised in 1989. It's just a remarkably serious problem. You have to say, I own a home, but I'm disabled. I can't have a strategic reserve to help fix my roof and that sort of thing. It's just a real problem. And, or imagine that I am a parent of a child who has a significant disability. I have to be really worried about not doing anything that's going to affect my child's eligibility for benefits. So let's say I have two children, Susan and Julie, and Julie lives with a disability and Susan doesn't, and I'm 78 years old. Well, I might say, well, you know what? I'm going to leave all of my, Susan, I'm going to give you my house, but I just want you to know that half of this house is really for your sister's needs. It's just, she can't have it because it would screw, if she officially had that, it would screw up the paperwork, jeopardize her benefits. So I'm going to give it to you, but I just want you to know that half of that money is really hers. And then Susan gets divorced. And now she and her husband are fighting about the value of that house. But there's no paperwork that says half of that house is really, for Susan's sister. You can imagine stuff like that. It's a real problem. Now, there are mechanisms that get around that. Most recently, there's something called ABLE accounts, which we study here in Illinois. And they're basically, it's like a college. It's like if your parents had a 529 account for your college, it's very similar. It's money that can be legally put aside, that doesn't count against that $2,000 limit, and that can be used to meet the needs of a person with disabilities. And it turns out if you look at where in Illinois people have these accounts, almost everyone who has an account is a young adult with an intellectual or developmental disability, and they tend to live almost always in a really high income, high SES zip code. Naperville, Winnetka, Chicago's near north sides. There's basically no able accounts on the south side of Chicago or the west side, where many SSI recipients live. And these sort of administrative complexity issues create huge disparities that that partly relate to people's access to information and resources, and then partly relate to the sort of behavioral economics of the situation. That families like mine that sort of have 529 accounts and stuff like that, and it's part of the rest of our other parts of our lives, the able account fits that groove really nicely in a way that doesn't for a lot of other people. So, the way I like to put things is that complexity creates disparity. That's actually my wife, Veronica, and her brother, Vincent. She's given him a shave during COVID. And fewer than 5% of eligible individuals in Illinois have able accounts, and people like Vincent are much more likely to have them because they're connected to, to high SES loved ones. It's not, and we're not doing anything bad, by the way. It's just that we're in a position to take advantage of a system that quite predictably is not helping people who don't have the privileges that we have. It's not like we are evil people because we are doing this, but we do have a responsibility as privileged people in the system to underscore what's happening and to find ways to improve it and to make it more equitable. So just here's a map of Illinois. The dark spots are where these accounts are, and we got the north side of Chicago. There's just nothing. This is the south side of Chicago. Nothing. We've got Naperville and related places there. I'm not sure what's happening in this particular one. It's very sparsely populated, but these are all pockets of affluence across the state. You say, why is that happening? Here's the paperwork. Here's actually, if you send away to the state of Illinois for paperwork on the ABLE account, this is actually like page 2. And if you look at this thing, someone like myself, given the job that I have, I'm like, oh, this looks like a lot of other financial paperwork that I get all the time. If you are not a PhD in public policy, University of Chicago person, and you're very reasonably very conservative, you don't want to do anything that's going to cause a problem for your loved one's essential benefits. You look at stuff like this and you're like, wow, this is really complicated, and I'm not so sure that this is the world's greatest idea. And this is just a real failure of cultural competence that we present information like this to to families that are trying to help their loved ones. I should also mention the fallacy of sunk costs. So so don't cry over spilled milk is the basic point in this behavioral economics point. So I spent weeks working on a paper. It turns out to be hard and boring. I'll still spend huge amounts of time trying to finish this bad paper, even though there's little likelihood that it will be good, because I just don't want to. I kind of don't want to admit that I just spent a lot of time on this thing that was kind of a waste of my time. Or, my girlfriend tells me she would break up with me, except she spent too much time putting my numbers into her phone. I used to tell that joke. Then I saw it on a phone ad, which they stole my joke. It's not that funny a joke anyway, but I should say that my girlfriend and I have been together for 34 years, and that she was in the picture with her brother. But the idea is that you're not thinking about the error in thinking is that you're focused on the investment that already happened, not the marginal costs and benefits of whatever you're doing in the future. That's the fallacy of the sunk cost. This is just a picture I took of Cloud's Gate one day, and people standing out in front of it. They're beautiful sculpture. By the way, I hope I get a chance to talk about some of the inequality issues around the loop. Just to give you a preview of it, try looking up where basketball courts are located in Chicago. Go to the Chicago Park District and try to find out where the nearest basketball court is to to Clouds Gate. As I noted, people really do respond to incentives. You don't have to be an economic, fanatic to believe that. The incentives are important. Higher unemployment benefits, COVID payments are going to reduce people's willingness to take a low wage job. And my wife, she got a COVID payment that was notably higher than her wage, and she's working as a care coordinator. And people pay attention to that. If you have really high taxes, that will affect people's willingness to work. If we think about loan forgiveness, the student loan forgiveness, presumably there will be some people who might take out more loans in the hope that those loans will be forgiven. Now, how much people respond to incentives, that's an empirical question. Very often, if you listen to people arguing about economics, they'll say, well, it's simple economics. Loan forgiveness will make people take out more loans. There's nothing about economics that tells us, is that going to be 4% of people? Is that going to be 40% of people? If economic theory conclusively says we should not have 100% tax on people's income. Rich people will definitely work less if we say we're going to tax them at 100%. But if we tax them at 50%, how much will that create adverse incentives? That's a factual question. That's not a question we can answer with theory. Now, good policies and interventions do try to create incentives, including psychic incentives, that push people to do the thing that we want them to do from a social perspective. And if you have policies that have, that create opposite incentives, those do tend to have unexpected, unintended, often undesired results. If you have a policy that says we're going to cap the rents in apartments for everybody, people are going to stay in their apartments. Maybe they're going to give their apartment to their kid or something like that. We're going to create some real incentive problems if the goal is to increase the supply of rental housing. If we say gas is we're going to have policies that keep gas really cheap, people are going to drive a lot more and they're going to buy less fuel efficient cars, and we're going to damage the planet and create congestion and pollution. If we say you can have a free carry-on on flights, people are going to carry a lot of crap onto the flight and fill the overhead bins. You want to align incentives with the way you want people to behave. It is, that is a very important principle. As I mentioned, principle of trade can make everyone better off. In general, efforts to inhibit trade often do more harm than good. If you look at the Fly American Act, that's a good example. And there's also something called the Jones Act that relates to shipping, where we are trying to protect American jobs, and we seem to have created a real mess. Markets are often a good way to organize economic activity, but not always. And same with government, as I mentioned before. As I read this slide, I realized, wow, this is a totally redundant slide. Sorry about that. Now let's talk about these market failures. So as I mentioned, externalities is a big one. My giant SUV raises your risk of death if I'm driving it on the highway. I don't have to pay for that. So I'm going to drive a tank that is dangerous. Information failures, I mentioned Marlboro and addiction. Of course, opioid manufacturers had a big incentive to understate the dangers of opioids when they were talking to doctors who might prescribe them. There's some interesting examples where HMOs that did a really great job in HIV and cancer care did not want that publicized because they were worried they were just going to get really expensive patients flocking to them without any kind of financial compensation for that. And so there was sort of some very weird situations where HMOs were found to be doing an excellent job with these, and they were telling the researchers, you cannot publish that, because we can't have all the cancer patients in Boston, and you're punishing us for doing a good job because financially we lose a lot of money on these patients. Understandable. Public good issues. We'll get to that. Missing markets is sort of an interesting one, that there's certain things that we'd love to have a market to deal with that don't actually exist. Imagine that we had a market, we're all sitting around, we're all zygotes, we're 16 cell zygotes, and we're sitting there, and we're talking about an insurance market. And we're saying, it's possible that I'll be born with Down syndrome and I'll have some real care needs and I'll have a lower wage. I think I want to buy insurance against that. Well, life's lottery is run before you can buy that insurance policy. And to some extent, social insurance is kind of saying, well, if we could have, if that fictional thing could actually happen, we would have set up something that's like, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, to protect each of us against risks that would just crush any one of us if we had to face it on our own. And that missing market problem is a significant one. Market power, most of the time that market power is on the producer side, but not always. So, monopoly is a serious problem, but also monopsony is a serious problem. Walmart has a huge amount of buying power that they're going to pay less for pickles than Jewel Osco is going to pay for pickles. And that creates some real challenges from economic policy perspective. First of all, the pickle maker may not be being treated fairly, but also may give Walmart a competitive advantage that creates some real policy problems. And one of the classic examples of monopsony and oligopsony is the way hospitals colluded to keep down the wages of nurses. And there were lots of ways that, and by the way, the Ivy League colleges would also get together and coordinate their financial aid. And the claim was, and there was some justification, was that they wanted to coordinate things so that they were not in bidding wars over and giving, that they were basically spending a lot of money to try to attract students with the highest prestige value, and that was going to burn up money they needed for students with the highest financial need. But there was clearly a part of that where they were colluding. And there's informal ways that, like, universities in the same cities very often kind of unofficially agree they don't try to recruit each other's faculty. And and that is that's oligopsony. That is designed so that they can keep down the wages of faculty. Government can sometimes improve on unregulated outcomes, but not always. Government actors have their own incentive problems. Government caters to concentrated interests, like the ethanol industry. Basically, any company that advertises on Sunday morning news shows probably is getting something they shouldn't get. Also, we have a voting mechanism. This one says the minority sometimes gets more than it deserves. This is the opposite. Sometimes the majority can bully the minority and create unfair outcomes when there's a particular small group that has very intensive needs. I mentioned the soft budget constraint. This is a lot like the too big to fail issue, where there's no real market accountability when the companies and the government are very intermingled. And everybody kind of understands that if Fannie and Freddie start to fail in the mortgage process, that they'll be bailed out. And of course, the political system is way more responsive to affluent and organized interests than to the poor and the disorganized. And we just have a ton of evidence for that. By the way, it's often, but not always, pushing in a more economically conservative direction. Because affluent and organized people are more socially liberal than others in America, there's certain policies where you sort of see the opposite is happening. But in general, that favors the economically privileged in a way that is that's certainly problematic. Also, private companies, we have consumer demand and we have stock prices that provide information and accountability that are often lacking in public policy. Suppose that, so for example, one of the things that we've seen in the energy industry is that the stock prices of of oil companies have really dropped. And one reason that they have really dropped is investors are saying, we got the climate change problem. And at some point, society is going to act to deal with that. And so I am not, as an investor, I'm not going to pay as much for Exxon Mobil stock as I otherwise would. Or there's a safety problem, there's a pharmaceutical company and they're selling opioids. And so far, nobody's sued the company, but investors are saying, you know what, this is out there and it's a real risk and the stock price is going to drop. And very often people who follow the stock pricing say, there's investors are really worried about X issue. And wow, something's going on here that we have to pay attention to. There's a failure by that company that is showing up in a lower stock price because the experts that are trying to evaluate whether to buy that stock are really worried about this issue. And certainly it's also the case that when private organizations perform very poorly, they're often punished by a competitive marketplace. And that is less true of government organizations. And unfortunately, this leads to some really pathetic outcomes. So if you look at public or nonprofit addiction treatment programs that are offering evidence-based treatment, outpatient methadone and Suboxone, very, very poor consumer interface. If you call them, much more likely to get a very poor response, very unfriendly response, sometimes a really off-putting, personally disrespectful response. If you call a for-profit residential addiction treatment program that is offering something that's not evidence-based, very, very expensive residential detox followed by, some time at the Canyon Ranch followed by not getting you connected to medications, they actually do a really good job of engaging the patients and figuring out how to help the patient come, join that treatment. Oh, yeah, we'll take your credit card. Yeah, we'll figure out how to, you got some issues about how to get here. We'll work with you about how to get that taken care of. And they're doing something that's definitely less beneficial to the patient than what the nonprofit or the public addiction treatment program is trying to do. But their business model requires them to reach out to people in a culturally competent way and engage them and try to convince them to come and buy the service. McDonald's and Burger King, much more culturally competent than the State Department of Health trying to help you get a COVID vaccine. And because, they just, where your treasure, your heart is. And, the fast food industry has spent a ton of money trying to figure out how to service low income communities of color where there's money to be made by selling hamburgers. And I think that's just a reality that is often a problem. Let's mention I'll give you one example from Gains from Trade, which comes from the standard example in every economics textbook up till about 1995 was Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. I must say this was also an element of tone deafness because the entire example had was often based on a very offensive paradigm. One of the things about Robinson Crusoe is, this guy's stranded on an island and then he runs into, someone, a person who's native to that island. Of course, the person who's native to that island, the first thing they want to do is work for Robinson Crusoe. It's just incredibly, the colonial foundation of that book is incredible. But if we go to Tom Hanks as a more acceptable alternative in Castaway, imagine that Tom can fish or harvest coconuts, and he can divide his time to achieve any of the following combinations of these two goods. If he spends all of his time doing coconuts, he can get 30 coconuts, no fish. Whoops. Or he can, if he spends a little bit less time on coconuts, he can get 20 fish. So the first 20 fish really only require him to give up 5 coconuts. Or he could, go down to 20 coconuts, and the next 10 fish require him to give up 5 coconuts. Or he can spend all of his time fishing. These possibilities, we call that his production possibility frontier. Now there's an opportunity cost here. If he spends, the more time he spends doing fishing, the less he can do coconuts and vice versa. And if Tom is on his own, he has to decide which point he wants. But there's no mathematically correct answer with which of these is the best. That depends on how much he likes fish and how much he likes coconuts. Probably intuitively, you sort of figure he's going to end up somewhere in the middle, because at some point he's going to be sick of, if he's only eating one thing, presumably he's going to get sick of that. But mathematically, the right answer could be any of these points. So here's his production possibility frontier sort of drawn out. And it's useful to point out a couple of things. So here's sort of all the points. If he's sort of, this thing is called his production possibility frontier. It's kind of the maximum he can get, is all these points along here. If he's at point C, that's maybe he's spending more time just chilling out, not doing either fishing or coconut growing. This is a feasible point, but it's off of the frontier. So we say that's sort of feasible, but not efficient. He can't be at this point D. That's beyond his capacity. At least when he's by himself, there's no way he can be consuming what's at D here. He can consume anything along this frontier, or actually anything inside it if he wanted. Now note the way that there's increasing opportunity cost. So, if he really wants to go from 25 coconuts to 30 coconuts, wow, he's got to give up a lot of fish for that. Presumably these are the coconuts that are like really they're the highest in the tree or whatever. Similar, and the same thing sort of holds here. Those last bit of fish, boy, he's got to give up a lot of coconuts to get them. It's just super time intensive to get those last little bit of fish. So production possibility frontiers often have this kind of bowed convex shape to it that reflects the idea that the last little bit of each thing, you really have to work hard to get. This is where you are in the lecture. That's a guy who's really bored by me giving a talk. By the way, economic growth is when this whole production possibility frontier moves out. So, imagine that I found a better way to fish, or just got better at fishing by practicing a lot. Well, my whole production possibility frontier kind of moves out. I now have things available to me that weren't available to me before. And this is really what economic growth is, that we're moving to a further point on the production possibility frontier. So now let's think about gains from trade. So Hank joins the island. He's an out-of-shape yuppie with issues. He's not as good at fishing or coconut harvesting as Tom is, but he's still there. He can still contribute. Because they've got, you'll see we've got some comparative advantages going on. So here's Tom's production possibilities, and here's Hank's production possibilities. So if there's no trade, Tom could be at this point here, 9 and 28. If there's no trade, Hank could be at this point, 8 and 6. You can see Hank's really, he's capable of getting, much less than Tom is of both of these goods. But notice that Hank is 2/3 as good at the coconut gathering, and he's only about 1/4 as good at the fish gathering. So you can imagine where this is going to go if they specialize, that Hank's going to spend a lot of time on coconuts, because he's just, fishing is not his thing. So, so here's their two production possibility frontiers. You can see Tom's is just way further out than Hank's is, but the slopes are different. Hank's pretty good at getting coconuts. He has to give up a lot of coconuts, though, if you have him doing any fishing. And Tom can spend more time fishing without having it completely damage his ability to do the coconut stuff. And so here's the way that we think about opportunity cost in these cases. So you can see that for each fish he catches, it's costing Tom 3/4 of a coconut, costing Hank 2 coconuts. Okay, and if you flip things around, each coconut that Tom gathers costs him 4/3 of a fish. Each coconut that Hank gathers costs him half a fish. Okay? Now, Tom, by the way, has an absolute advantage in everything, but Hank's comparative advantage in coconuts makes a big difference. By the way, subtle question. Suppose that Hank can't eat coconuts at all due to hypochondria. What does that do to the way they might allocate their time to produce things and also to trade things? Good thing to think about. So there's nothing in any of these graphs about how much either one would actually enjoy or benefit from eating a coconut or eating a fish. So turns out that doesn't matter in an interesting way. And so it turns out if they trade, each one can end up outside of the production possibility frontier that they would get if they were just by themselves. So Hank ends up here, Tom ends up here. Oops, sorry. So so trading benefits both of them. It's actually benefiting Hank more than it's benefiting Tom in this particular example. Okay. And it's so that basically Tom can spend more of his time fishing and rely on Hank to pick up some of the coconut stuff, and Tom can catch a lot more fish if he spends more time fishing. And then they can trade, and they both end up better off. Okay. That's Golden Gate Bridge. By the way, I took this picture 4 hours after I got up really early and went out and took pictures from that bridge. And it was about 5:30 in the morning, and I was standing there with my tripod at the railing right at the middle, right about here. And this police officer comes over to me, and he's on a bicycle, and he said, "I've never been so happy to see somebody with a tripod." This thing, there is no the railing was basically up to my navel, easily hopped, no barrier for any kind of if someone was at risk of self-harm. And it was and this poor police officer's job was to bicycle, to keep people safe, and such a literally a structural failure to protect people, in this example. So it is as people, as social workers and allied professionals, we really have a responsibility to pay attention to stuff like this and say, it's got to be fixed. Now, by the way, what specific arrangement would they do? That's a little hard to know, but they're going to bargain and both benefit from trade. Because there's only two people, it kind of depends on how much they like fish and coconuts. Note, by the way, also that Tom is more productive. They still can do mutual gain through trade, but Tom is still going to end up much richer than Hank is. So the inequality wasn't caused by trade, but it's not fully addressed by trade either. And if we think there's an issue of fairness or equity, I was sort of making light of Hank, being a yuppie with issues, whatever. But suppose he's just, it's just harder for him to fish for whatever reason. Maybe he has a vision problem or something. There's nothing in them trading that is going to that's going to guarantee that they have an equitable outcome. The only thing it will guarantee is that they will each be better off than if there was no trading. But it is not clear that it's going to lead to a fully equitable outcome in this case or any other case. Now, within a huge economy, things are often simpler because we have market price. We have lots of people fishing and gathering coconuts, and you don't have individual bargaining and sort of all the idiosyncrasies that come with that. There'll be prices that will be set that, that sort of handle this without a clunky bartering system. But just to recap this part, the comparative advantage aspect, the opportunity cost of producing the good is lower for that individual than for other people. That makes trade possible. Absolute advantages, you can do something better than other people. Those are different concepts. So the opportunity cost, if I just go back, the opportunity cost for Tom to gather another coconut is 4/3 of a fish. The opportunity cost for Hank to gather another coconut is half a fish. So presumably we want Hank at the margin, we want Hank to spend more time on coconuts because there'd be less of a hit on how much fish is being caught. That's the insight for comparative advantage. Some issues around world trade. Low-income societies have a comparative advantage that flows from their low land and labor costs, and allowing them to allowing trade that draws on, I would say the word exploit, of course that word becomes loaded, brings large benefits to producers and also to consumers, but has big distributional consequences in wealthier societies, and also, by the way, sometimes in the less wealthy society as well. And sometimes, by the way, concentrated interest groups try to block that trade. As I mentioned, the bottom bullet, the United Auto Workers really tries to block, importation of automobiles to the United States or constrain it, because clearly that is in their economic interest. And most of the studies indicate that for every car that is blocked from imports by various trade restrictions, it costs very substantial amounts per, say, auto worker job saved in the United States, usually 6 figures, if you look at the impact on consumers. I should say that there are also issues that affect low-income societies when we have very aggressive trade. One reason being that some of these societies don't have the full institutional infrastructure to protect citizens from very predictable consequences of that trade. So, one of the things that we see is when US firms, European firms, Japanese firms, Chinese firms draw upon the capacities of lower income nations where they want to set up production, things like that. Very often the companies will do things like they will bribe local officials so they can pollute and not follow worker safety standards and so on. And so we see examples where globalization can lead to harm in societies where we definitely want that production capacity to expand in those places. We want people in Vietnam to have the opportunity to participate in global trade. We want to make sure that the people of Vietnam have institutional structures, that protect them from ways that their employers might engage in misconduct that harms the local communities. I'll end with this circular flow diagram, which we often use, which is the economy is made up of households that consume stuff, made up of firms that produce stuff, that sell to households through these markets for goods and services, and households have money, which they provide to the firms. There's also factor markets that are markets that firms draw on to produce things. So, the labor market, there's workers get paid wages to produce cell phones that firms produce. Firms provide money to those workers, which go into households, which the workers then use sometimes to buy cell phones and other things. And so there's a kind of circular flow going on where, and then when the households buy those cell phones, that provides the money that the firms use to hire the factors that they need. And factors of production include labor, but also land, labor, and capital are sort of the three dominant things. So in the textbook, they present this circular flow diagram. I think one of the key points for us to understand is factors of production are really important. That people's wages are set by how valuable their labor can be for firms. And there's also other factors of production that are important as well, that must be paid for by firms as part of the production process. So that's that circular flow diagram. So good luck in my class. This is just a bird that I took a picture of in Humboldt Park, and I look forward to working with you. And I'm going to stop now.